Everyone. Welcome to Transforming Anthropology's event honoring Edmund T Gordon, Reflections on the Cultural Politics of Black Masculinity, with panelists Dr. Keisha-Khan Perry and Dr. Jonathan Gayles. My name is Savannah Kostanek, and I am one of Transforming Anthropology's editorial assistants. And this Honoring Our Elders event is part of a series of events that TA is hosting for our ABA 50th anniversary issue. Dr. Gordon's article, The Cultural Politics of Black Masculinity, originally published in TA in 1997, is one of the groundbreaking essays featured in the issue and is commented on by Dr. Gayles and Dr. Perry. So today we're just going to reflect on that article, celebrate Dr. Gordon, and discuss Black masculinity, activist research, and institutional change in the academy. Just a couple notes on Zoom. I'm sure we're all experts by now, but for those of us who aren't, this Zoom webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the TA YouTube page at a later date. People can send chat messages privately to a specific person, just to the hosts and the panelists, or to everyone, including the attendees. You need to select who you want to send the message to in the drop-down panel. And just so you are aware, the host can see all the messages, including ones just sent to one person. We do have a live captioner for this event. There is a tab to show and hide the closed captioning. So if you do have questions for the panelists, please click on the Q&A icon and submit your questions. If you would like to ask your question verbally instead of by writing it out, the host and the co-host can allow specific attendees to unmute themselves to ask questions. So if that's a need for you, then we can try and figure that out as well. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists and guests today. I'm going to begin with Dr. Perry. So Dr. Keisha-Khan Perry earned her PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin in 2005. She's an associate professor of Africana Studies at Brown University, and she specializes in the critical study of race, gender, and politics in the Americas, with a particular focus on Black women's activism, urban geography, and questions of citizenship, feminist theories, intellectual history, and disciplinary formations, and the interrelationship between scholarship, pedagogy, and political engagement. Dr. Perry's Black Women Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, is an ethnographic study of Black women's activism in Brazilian cities. She is currently writing Anthropology for Liberation, Research, Writing, and Teaching for Social Justice, while working on 2 other research projects. She is engaged in a study which documents and analyzes the historical paradox of citizenship and Black land ownership and loss in Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States. She's also working on a multilingual and transnational exploration of Black women's political work in Latin America by critically examining how Black women mobilize political movement across borders and how they understand themselves as agents in creating a diasporic community. Okay, and Dr. Gayles. Dr. Jonathan Gayles received his PhD in applied anthropology from the University of South Florida, and he is the professor and chair of African American Studies at Georgia State University. His primary areas of research include the anthropology of education, Black masculinity, and critical media studies. In 2012, he produced the award-winning documentary on African American comic book superheroes entitled White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinities in Comic Books. In 2013, the Popular Culture Association awarded the documentary the Peter Rollins Best Documentary Film Award. He also produced The E-Word, a documentary on the Ebonics debate, which examines the context of the national fur in response to the Oakland Unified School District's resolution on Ebonics. During his tenure at Georgia State University, he served as the inaugural Associate Dean for Undergraduate Learning in the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Associate Provost for Institutional Effectiveness. As Associate Provost, he led Georgia State University's consolidation with the former Georgia Perimeter College. This is the largest consolidation in the history of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. He recently served as chair of the University Task Force for Racial Equality. Okay, and last but not least is Dr. Gordon. Dr. Gordon did send a bio, but we're elaborating on it a little bit from the TA thing. The issue, just to speak to his really great career. Dr. Edmond T Gordon is the University of Texas at Austin's Vice Provost for Diversity and the founding chairman emeritus of the African and African Diaspora Studies Department. His teaching and research interests include culture and power in the African diaspora, gender studies, critical race theory, race education, and the racial economy of space and resources. Dr. Gordon's decade-long stay in the town of Bluefields, Nicaragua, resulted in the book Disparate Diasporas: Identity and Politics in an African Nicaraguan Community, a testament to long-term ethnographic engagement and social struggle. Throughout his academic career, Dr. Gordon has contributed to a scholarly model of activist research and foregrounded the need for institutional change by building spaces when none were available. Through faculty recruitment and development, and especially through graduate study and training, the Austin School has transformed the presence of Black anthropologists in the academy and anthropology as a discipline in general. Dr. Gordon has supervised over 30 doctoral students and has served on numerous dissertation committees. He continues his service work through the creation of a racial geography tour of UT Austin that describes how race and gender are constructed through the monuments and architecture of the campus. In 2014, Dr. Gordon received UT's highest honors, a presidential citation, and in 2016, the Pro Bene Emeritus Award from the College of Liberal Arts. From 2015 to 2018, he was an elected member of the Austin Independent School District's Board of Trustees. Dr. Gordon is also past president of ABA. So please join me in welcoming our panelists and guests. And we can get started with some questions as well. I wanted to start with you, Dr. Gordon, because you've spoken about the long activist history of Black and other racialized folks at UT Austin since the first Black student attended over 70 years ago. And you yourself have been at UT Austin for over 30 years. So I'm just wondering, did you have a vision for the Austin School when you started? Or did that vision and need become more apparent over the course of your time
there? No, I didn't have a precise vision for the Austin School when I began. I was coming to UT. In fact, my first 2 years at the University of Texas, I spent basically living in Nicaragua. It was the late 1980s. And they hired me, allowing me to spend 8 months of the year in Nicaragua and come up to teach for 4 months. And there I was, in Nicaragua, I was a member of an activist research and pedagogy collective called CARC, the Centro de Estudios, I can't even remember what it was. Basically, it was a group that was looking at basically race relations on the Caribbean coast and the fraught relationship between the Sandinistas and Black folks and indigenous folks. And so when I got to Austin, my immediate response was to look around to see how similar kind of collectives could be created in a new circumstance. And, with some trials and errors, I had been, well educated both in kind of diaspora theory and politics by Sinclair Drake at Stanford, and also on kind of diasporic revolutionary politics by Bridget O'Loughlin, who was there at the same time. So I was looking to combine those things in terms of creating a collective, and ended up doing so within the anthropology department, using resources that were garnered through the Center for at that point, the Center for Afro-American and African Studies, ultimately headed by Sheila Walker. And we were able to put together the resources necessary to be able to support graduate students. And so the collective basically became a graduate student and training oriented activist scholarly operation, which morphed into the Austin School eventually. So no, but I did arrive there with the idea that the way that I wanted to develop and the way that one should develop activist scholarly work as collectively.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Perry, so you kind of come out of that tradition, obviously. For those who don't know already, Dr. Gordon was Dr. Perry's dissertation advisor. And so obviously the focus on land claims, activist anthropology, and diasporic studies is evident in your work. Can you speak a little bit more to that, like how Dr. Gordon has shaped your work and how the Austin School has kind of informed that trajectory from even when you started to then coming into the program? And then also, if you could also speak to how the Austin School has impacted like anthropology beyond UT Austin specifically.
First, I want to thank you all for organizing this. If there's one person that I could think of honoring today, of course, it would be Dr. Edmond T Gordon. So I'm excited to be a part of this and for Transforming Anthropology for asking me to write the essay, and for you, Savannah, for organizing and getting all of us here together. So thank you for that. Who better to celebrate than Dr. Gordon? And I wrote just a few comments because I wanted to remember my thoughts. I also didn't want to start to get all emotional and crying or anything like that. So I thought I had a brief reflection, and I won't read all of it, but I'll just read from the very, just a piece of it for now. And then when you ask the other questions, I'll touch on some other things. So I try to teach the Austin School Manifesto almost every semester as a way to frame my intellectual and political approach to teaching and scholarship. Reading the manifesto always reminds me of just how special Edmund T Gordon is and UT Austin was for me as a doctoral student. But I used the essay to tell them more about Ted and why his work at that university and with me was so important for the work that I currently do. I was a direct benefactor of the Austin School. And I should say that I always reflect on the other folks like Jemima Pierre, Mark Anderson, Amanda Walker-Johnson, Kia Lily Caldwell, Mark Anderson, Jennifer Gett. There's so many people who came out at that time, Whitney Battle Baptiste. There's so many really important scholars that came out. Junaid Rana were part of that particular project, in addition to the professors who were at UT at that time, Aseli Angela Johnny, Jafari Allen came later, Juan Costa Vargas, of course. So, but today really brings back so many more good memories for me. For example, sitting in my apartment facing the Bay of All Saints, and Dr. Gordon calling to tell me about the African Diaspora Studies graduate program in anthropology. He said, your mother told me to get in line, which I said to him, that's not true. I was only seriously considering one other university that had only one Black professor. And he said, well, there's your answer. We have 5. And that was an important, he pretty much saved my graduate career, I should say, from that one phone call, when people used to actually call people. So, and I also remember the time when my housing fell through, and he and Daisy hosted me at their house while I looked for a place to live. And for anyone who knows the personal motivations for me doing the political work that I do today and the intellectual work around housing, having experienced houselessness, that personal gesture was really important to me. Or when he and Charlie hired me to do research in Belize, and I called him to say that I missed the boat back to Belize City and got stuck on Key Caulker. And he said, did I ever tell you about the time I was in Belize City and there was a pool of blood in the middle of my hotel room? And I remember we laughed on the phone saying, well, I guess swimming with sharks and stingrays on Key Caulker wasn't as bad as that. Or I also remember the relief on his face when I told him that I wanted to switch my dissertation project to focus on Black land rights in Salvador and not the project on the cultural production of Iliaye that I had proposed in my application essay. I think we were both relieved. So he stayed late in his office working on the National Science Foundation application essay that I was later awarded that fellowship. He called Daisy periodically to explain why he was late getting home. I felt so bad, and with the usual sigh, he said, "This is the job." which today, in this past week alone, having done about 15 letters of recommendation, I'll always remember this is the job. So I was also not an easy advisee. I complained about the unfair advantage that the male students had. You guys are probably out there playing basketball, Mark Anderson and Mark Perry, discussing Gramsci and James, while we have to make appointments to office hours. He said that, and his reply was, well, he was a quote unquote recovering sexist. And I said, well, aren't we all recovering sexists? So, and then after the dissertation defense and the degree was filed, I looked at him and really seriously concerned, saying, and I had no idea how academia worked. I said, is this it? Is this the end of our relationship? And is this the end of your role as an advisor? And he said, nah, you can still call me. Actually, I think he should have said, don't ever send me an email, okay? Because I'll never answer. But you can call me. So I always tell my students about the importance of the advisor and how you start your academic career, precisely because one of the most important lessons for me was his integrity, not just as a scholar, but also as a person. And that the that intellectual and political integrity that I learned from him drives me in all aspects of my lives. And that integrity is probably the main cachet. So it's basically how we get paid. I always tell students that honesty is how we get paid in academia, and our integrity is all we have. And sticking with our political projects, for example, when I told my dissertation, my doctoral student, Nicosia Shakes, about sticking with her feminist project, and that one could build a career as a Black feminist, I think was really important. So intellectual integrity and staying true to the work, and not not to oversimplify, but not selling out. Also, what the Austin School, and I'll stop right here and I can talk more later, but what the Austin School Manifesto and what Austin School was all about, and maybe I should blame him today for being overworked and tired and all of that, is that part of the work was building a legacy. Part of the work was building an institution that was way beyond us as individual scholars. Part of it was also building friendship. I really admired his friendship with Charlie, even when I criticized Charlie's shorts running across campus. But I really admired the kind of collaboration with other scholars and activists in leaving behind an institution for a next generation of scholars. So building Africana studies and hiring folks and bringing in students, and why that was important and how that continues to drive the work that I do. So I would say that the Austin School in terms of teaching has greatly impacted me, and realizing that UT was just such a unique place, but also driving the kind of work that I continue to do inside these academic spaces. So I'll stop right there. I can keep going for sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for sharing that. That was really lovely to hear, so thank you. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. Dr. Gayles, I want to kind of talk a little bit about Black masculinity for a moment. So you've written and produced documentary work that grapples with Black masculinity and representation, especially in comic book and films. And you've addressed the importance of Black male agency that Gordon talks about in his article. You kind of commented that on that in your commentary. Can you speak to the impact of that article on your work? And I'm thinking specifically about your documentary, White Scripts and Black Supermen, and then of course your article on Black masculinity and misogyny in Blade.
Thank you very much. And I want to second my gratitude second the expression of gratitude to all of you for organizing this. I'm very honored to participate. I'll start with a funny story. My late father, when I told him that I was planning to earn a PhD in anthropology and applied anthropology specifically, his comment to me was, that damn Indiana Jones, all right? So he was being funny, but for him, his only point of reference was Indiana Jones, and he couldn't understand. My father was a chemist, and he couldn't understand why I was interested. And it was driven by my own frustration with school psychology and the way in which these tests were used to place students, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to be a school psychologist, was to sort of stand in the doorway against the disproportionate placement of students of color into special ed classes. And so I started my program, and I was immediately frustrated with the degree to which, especially in the anthropology of education at the time, the overwhelming majority of the research focused on why Black kids fail in school. And I was just completely put off and frustrated. And then I discovered the article. And what the article did for me and how it influenced my own work was, I think I can think of it in three ways. One, and I deal with this today in my own teaching and writing, is moving beyond a dichotomous engagement of Black masculinity. So either Black men are perpetrators of gendered violence, or they are victims of white supremacy. So either they're one or the other. And what Gordon told us almost 25 years ago is that the truth of the matter is that Black men certainly can be both and are both. And not only that, Black men can visit the kind of gendered violence that we see on each other, if we think about Gordon's notions of reputational practices, et cetera. And so that for me was extremely important. I didn't know how important it was then, but it was something that was very important for me. The other piece was the kind of kinetic engagement of Black masculinity as not being inextricably anchored to these ideas about Black men, right? And so Black men then have the ability to act on their environments instead of always being acted on by our environments. So yeah, these are very, very persistent and obstinate ideas about the Black masculine body, but they are not inextricably anchored to the body. And to talk in the article about masculinity instead of manhood is also very, very important, because it renders this notion as a performance instead of some kind of fixed idea that's written upon the Black masculine body. And so that too was important. In fact, as I finished the documentary and I was in conversations with California Newsreel about the title, the original title was White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinity, singular, in comic books. And I argued for Black masculinities to speak to the fact that there are, of course, multiple performances, multiple expressions, a very dynamic kind of, as he said, cultural repertoire. And certainly as it relates to the first African-American superheroes, the documentary indicates that these old ideas reemerge even in this imagined space. Gordon's work, Dr. Gordon's work, then focusing on masculinity and then, sort of separating it from the Black masculine body was a very, very important idea to me, and it remains so. And the last piece is this idea of agency. Working now in African-American studies in my academic appointment for almost 17 years now, and it's true for all of us, agency is very, very important. So going back to this idea of moving away from a dichotomous representation of Black masculinity, the idea that we can speak to these experiences of Black masculinity, the expressions of Black masculinity by multiple, many different kinds of bodies, and really allow for a sense of agency and engaging and embracing the way in which we perform in multiple ways instead of defaulting to these very limited ideas. One of the secrets that I pretend to tell my students on the first day of class is that Black people are human beings. This semester in Intro to African American Studies, we will learn that Black people are human beings. And I think one of the things that Ted Gordon's article did and so many years ago, it is essentially, it makes the assertion that Black men are human beings, and these kinds of expressions of Black masculinity is an expression of that humanity in all of its many forms. And so for me, that really influenced my work. And very quickly to the Blade article, one of the things that we can certainly glean from the article is the way in which this kind of socialization creates a series of critical blindnesses. And so Blade is a fairly old movie, but I loved it. I watched it 5 times in a theater. And I loved it until I realized how Blade's power as a hero comes at the direct expense of the Black women with whom he shares dialogue. So hopefully I just ruined the movie for everyone watching, but I encourage you to watch it again. And so because of my critical blindness, because of my own socialization, and that critical blindness allowed me to ignore the violence that Wesley Snipes as Blades visits upon these Black women. And so these are old ideas that stuck with me from reading Dr. Gordon's article, this idea of how we can be both victims of white supremacy, but also perpetrators of violence. And so I have a great deal of gratitude to Dr. Gordon, and for this work, because as I said then, for me, initially, I had the stereotypical notion of what an anthropologist was, Birkenstocks and pith helmets. And I was able to locate myself in the discipline as a result of his work, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gayles, for sharing that. Dr. Gordon, so just to kind of continue with what Dr. Gayles was speaking about in terms of your article, it was published over 23 years ago. And as we're thinking about the agency of Black men and how Black men can engage that cultural repertoire and pull different kind of cultural resources through that agency, I'm curious if you've seen any like shifts or patterns in the way that some Black men, obviously there's a lot of variability and it shifts depending on context, but in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and this increased visibility of Black male death, because obviously that's been going on always, but in this kind of increased visibility, do you see and the negotiation of that cultural repertoire shifting at all?
Yes and no. One of the things that some of the concepts that are in that original article have enabled me to kind of develop is different perspectives on things like the recent movements for Black liberation, even things like the Black Lives Matter movement. That article, written 23 years ago, was written in response to a number of things in my intellectual life. One was, as I said, I had been in Nicaragua for 10 years, for a decade, and outside of academia. And so that article is the culmination of another 10 years of growth back in academia in the United States. And so when I had left the US academia, there was no such thing as cultural studies. I don't think there was any such thing as that I knew of, like Black feminism. Of course, there's the Kumbaya River Collective stuff, which I guess I was vaguely familiar with. And Alice Walker, I used one of her quotes and actually what ended up being the book. But one of the reasonable critiques of my work that students like Keisha-Khan came in, actually from when I came back, Black women in particular were all over my work because it didn't have a gendered analysis. It was, I will take credit, at least in Nicaragua, for developing an intersectional approach, but that was a race and class approach, which studiedly ignored gender and which had no analysis of patriarchy as a semi-independent axis of power and inequity. And so that article and the work around it is the attempt to come to grips with patriarchy as an active force and as a really important issue to grapple with alongside, in some sense, with race and class. And so, the thing that's not even really drawn out as well as it should be in that particular article is the ways in which patriarchy underpins this cultural repertoire of masculinity in determinate ways. And so that's a long way to get to your question. And so the emphasis on patriarchy that appears in nation form in that article, and that's kind of built in terms of my thinking on these things, has allowed me to begin to think about the ways in which, at least in the United States and probably in the Western world, are the outrage of the Black community as it sort of about our positionality as it kind of moves through time in waves and fits and starts and all that. Our outrage is mostly energized by atrocities in relationship to young Black men. And the way that the patriarchal narratives that are associated with, I guess, modernity, but certainly with Christianity, in terms of the martyrdom of the young male and the martyrdom of the young male as being what is the basic outrage, which kind of signals the need to resist and revolt, continues with us. And it's very strong in the Black community. And so if you think about even Black Lives Matter, we are almost always mobilized into action when a young Black male of some sort or another has been killed, murdered, martyred. And so, yes, I've seen some changes in the ways in which some Black men operate within the repertoire of masculinity that's open to us. But I think the Black community, well, this is no blinding insight. The Black community and its politics and its sociality is still patriarchal at heart, even when we think that we're engaging in radical politics.
Thank you so much for that. That is, thank you. Yeah, that is really great to think through. I have a question for all of the panelists, if you want to answer. So I'm just thinking about how you've all worked within and outside of the academy. Dr. Gayles, you're an applied anthropologist, and you've recently served as the chair of the University Task Force for Racial Equality. Dr. Perry, you have been deeply engaged in activist struggles in Salvador. And Dr. Gordon, we've talked obviously about your work in the academy and outside. How have you negotiated your positions within and outside of the academy to create institutional or social change? And then how have you kind of resisted the contradictions of institutionalizing activist research? And what kind of, is there a price that you've had to pay for that? And if so, like what is that price? I don't know who would like to to take that.
I can start just to think about that. I would say that perhaps one of the shocks I experienced after graduating from UT was just how vastly different the rest of academia was, right? So I had little experience with academics. I knew little about academia. And there's no one in my family. I mean, my mom's a lawyer. My father works in computer science. So there was really not a lot of experience with, what happens in academia. So for me, my introduction to academia really was at the University of Texas at Austin and what academic life was about. And I thought that since, I wasn't going to be a lawyer, that I could do my political work through academia. And so part of the social justice component was, where am I gonna do this work? And it's through teaching and scholarship and working alongside social movements. And that was well entrenched in the activist track at UT, as well as the African Diaspora Studies program. So that's what I thought, was gonna be welcome in all Black studies spaces, even among, but I would say that that's not what happened. And I think even in Africana and Black studies spaces, there is oftentimes this separation between theory and praxis, and that there are some people who do theory and there are other folks who do something else. So I think there's this binary that ends up being reproduced, even in how we understand so-called Black radical thought, right? That thought is separate from praxis. And that was completely opposite what I had learned at the University of Texas. And that present day social movements should be informing how we understand the radical tradition and how the radical tradition is changing over time. So I think, and across space and time. So I thought that was one of the biggest lessons out of UT, but also one of the biggest shocks in terms of working in other academic spaces. I would say that what ends up happening to a certain degree is I continued to do the work that I was doing. There was no way to change course. It was not like all of a sudden I could write a totally different dissertation project. And I took the advice of scholars like Ted Gordon, but certainly, for example, in my department, Lundy Braun, who's just said, do the work that you want to do and the rest will fall into place. I'm not sure if there was a price to pay other than the fact that I do think that activist scholarship is oftentimes not seen as good scholarship. It's oftentimes seen as not theoretical enough or ethnographic, falling into that category, except for when I'm watching webinars today or looking at lectures today, and Black women activists or just activist voices are still being brought to the conversation, is still seen as radical, right? So people contacting me saying that, for example, that I'm citing unknown scholars. And I remember at my dissertation defense, I remember Ted was looking at me like, who are those people? So, and according to Donna Irasi, it's like, who are those folks? So, but at the same time, that was encouraged and that was seen as part of the scholarly work that we're doing, but not always accepted or as part of the radical tradition. So everyday Black women, for example, that are speaking out against the violence. So for example, you see Deb Thomas's work on women who've experienced the massacre in Kingston, for example, them speaking in their own voice. And I think I saw her comment in the chat. But, so for example, to have these kinds of activists speak for themselves as scholars and bringing them to the classroom space is something that I learned coming out of UT. So I think in some ways, one of the things that was encouraged from UT as well is that just having a certain kind of academic courage to say, just pave your own path and do your own thing independent of what may happen institutionally. So bringing activists to speak in their own voice in classroom spaces, as well as in our scholarship, I think was something that was encouraged. So independent of what the critiques may be, I think it was still well worth it. But even that book, Anthropology for Liberation, that I've been working on for so long, I remember a colleague, looking at me and telling me I should write that book after tenure. That's not why it's taken me so long to write that book. It's, small child is why I've taken so long to write that book. But, someone looked at me with a straight face and told me to wait. So I think it's also ironic now when I just got the Engaged Scholar Award at Brown. And I was like, that's funny. To a certain, I had, another colleague tell me, we're gonna have to figure out a way to frame it in your tenure file. And I was like, I don't, not anything. I do publish in academic journals. I think I can make the cut for academic requirements, but there was a perception that the activist scholar is not actually doing scholarship required to advance in academia. And I don't want to say exactly what I said. I think I said something around, I published beyond the church bulletin and, and the final call. But I do think there's a perception that activists aren't doing scholarship, or activist scholars or people working in the advancement of liberation aren't doing scholarship. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. Dr. Gordon or Dr. Gayles, do you want to address that at all?
I'll address it briefly. One of the things about, if you want to call it activist scholarship, or at least for me, is that I don't think of it all as any kind of sacrifice. It's what I wanted to do, and even more than that, Kamala Visvesvaram once nicknamed me Spike Lee, because one of the things I've been concerned about is to do the right thing. And so doing the kind of work that I do, I think, is just doing the right thing. I also enjoy it, but it's doing what's necessary. It's doing the work. So it's not a sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice at all. And in terms of trade-offs, I don't really think of it as in terms of trade-offs. And in fact, one of the things that's true about the kind of university I'm in, and probably most of the kind of universities that our listening audiences in, is that they need us. Every university needs to have some small group, with the emphasis on small, of relatively radical, boisterous, and demanding Black faculty members, because otherwise they can't prove that they're, that academic freedom reigns there, and that it's a marketplace of ideas and all this kind of thing. So they need to have us. And in some sense, I've been amply rewarded for having a big mouth and pushing the envelope on some of these issues. Now, that doesn't mean I've been academically rewarded. I'm still an associate professor, basically because the stuff that I do, a lot of the stuff that I do, the department at UT, the Black Studies department at UT, is currently battling over this, and I thank you, Cherie Smith, for doing this. But it's not recognized as academic. On the other hand, I get paid a lot of money, and I get a bunch of rewards, and I have the space to operate, and I have the space to denounce the university's racism and sexism and et cetera, which I think is doing the right thing, and also which they need. It's lash me again, because if otherwise we won't be understood to be the kind of university we want to be. So there's a real contradiction that's involved there. But it's not a sacrifice. I haven't sacrificed anything.
Thank you. Dr. Gayles, did you want to speak to this?
I do, yeah. This question is surfacing a lot for me, and I'll try to be brief. So I remember, I believe it was my first AAA conference. It might have been in San Francisco, and I think I bought Jafari Allen a shot. And I was so excited. It was my first conference, you understand? And I remember, I cannot remember her name, but she was someone that I admired, whose work I admired, and I was preparing to go to the Council on Anthropology of Education reception. And I went up to her and I said, are you going to the reception? And she said, no, child, no. And I said, well, why not? She said, I am tired of white people expecting me to make them comfortable. And I said, well, that sounded a little, maybe, I don't know. I'm still excited, I'm going. And of course, there was a photographer there, and I felt that the photographer followed me around during the entire reception. And I ended up on the, sort of the newsletter or whatever. And I said, oh, okay, I was used. Fast forward many, many years later, and I'm asked to chair the University Task Force on Racial Equality. And speaking to some of what Dr. Gordon mentioned, part of it is because I've been vocal around certain issues at Georgia State. Part of it is because I'm chair of African American Studies. And so I knew that accepting this role meant that I would have a platform, an opportunity to move Georgia State, but it also meant that I was going to be used. There was no way around it, right? And so being able to mention my name added some legitimacy. And so I still struggle with the idea of resisting within the institutional structure. I am reminded, and I have to remind people, that although Georgia State is in Atlanta, Atlanta is in Georgia. So you drive 15 minutes outside of Atlanta and you might find yourself in a different decade. And so, you know, the University System of Georgia reports to the Georgia Board of Regents, and they have absolutely zero investment in the liberation of people of color. And so I still struggle with what it means to be an academic in an institution, right? And so I'm thinking about something that Martin Luther King Jr. once said about turning away from the status quo, the church, into the inner ecclesia. And in my mind, what I found most powerful is moving outside of the university and broadening our connections to the community, because there are simply some things that we cannot do within the sort of the boundaries of the university. Simply cannot do. The price that is paid, of course, is the tax that we, you know, which we are all familiar. You know, I joke sometimes, our department has literally, I mean, it's very literal, we have a red, black, and green door, right? And so I joke about being safe behind the red, black, and green door. It's only when I go outside of the door where I find some challenges at my university. But it's all important work, right? But I still, even in reflecting on my role on the task force, I wonder if I was able to make the most of that opportunity to challenge Georgia State as it relates to everything that's been happening politically, or if Georgia State made the most of their opportunity to use me as a face for it. So I hope I did enough, but it's something, to be frank, that with which I still struggle in the present day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gayles. I think that we have some time for questions now from the audience. Are we okay to open up to the audience now? I'm gonna just look at the Q&A box. We have a question from Deidre Crumley. Dr. Gordon, how did the way you were or were not mentored as a PhD student in anthropology inform the way you approached mentoring and institution building? You approached mentoring and institution building in your career in life?
You know, it was a long time ago. As I mentioned before, I was mentored. I went to Stanford for my PhD, and my advisor there, my original advisor there, was Bridget O'Loughlin, who was a student of Sidney Mintz. She was a young faculty member, untenured, Marxist economist, Marxist economic anthropologist, and I was probably her only student. So she put a lot of time into trying to help me to be disciplined enough to be a scholar, which was a struggle. You know, being a young Black man on the West Coast in the mid 1970s, you know, it was, yeah, all right. So being a scholar was making a scholar out of me was a struggle, and she did that. But the other thing is that she was, you know, one of the persons who showed me that politics could and should be combined with scholarship. And in fact, Sinclair Drake was another mentor. I TA for his classes. So one of the things I learned from Drake was how to put together a class, and how it is that narratives that come from experiences of Blackness can be really valuable pedagogical tools. But one of the things that happened was, as I went to the field to do my research, Bridget left to join Frelimo in Mozambique. So she went to join the revolution, which she did. And that was an act of mentorship, which really had a huge influence on me. And it's what ended me up, well, it's one of the things that ended me up in Nicaragua during the 1980s. In other words, that academics like us could make a contribution in revolutionary situations. Now, as we know, that those revolutionary moments are no longer with us, but that had a lasting effect. And then you combine that with Drake and his deep kind of connection. It's not just knowledge, but connection and experience with the diaspora, and the importance of the differences of Blackness, and how the differences of Blackness can be the basis for thinking about an ethical community of practice. And that's a little abstract, but that was deeply influential as well. And so the two, what's really most basic to my work is the notion that my scholarship and pedagogy can both bring together an ethical community, an ethical, basically Black community, and that together we can transform the world. And those two people taught me that. So it's, I don't know, it was very important in those kinds of ways, in some practical ways as well. But that framework is what I brought into the rest of my experience as an academic and an activist and whatever else I am.
I just wanted to follow up to that and say one of the reasons why I'm always so thankful that I went to UT, that it was Ted Gordon who was there, is precisely that, is that he not just embodied he basically practiced what he was teaching and what he talked about and lived it. And I would say that in the early years, there was a lot of, I would say, not shame, but a little bit of disbelief in terms of how much I myself had probably bought into narratives, popular narratives around Black masculinity that was toxic, that was pathological, all of that he describes in the scholarship and the cultural studies scholarship describes. So for me, he was probably one of the first Black men that was living in a way that I had not known to be possible. And I felt a lot of shame around the fact that I had also consumed a lot of those narratives and believed a lot of those ideas about Black men and how they are in our lives as scholars, as mentors, as friends, and to watch them parent and have lifelong partnerships and so forth. So I think for me, he was one of the first people to really make that shift. And I don't know, and it's sometimes I'm a little bit kind of ashamed to say it, but I mean, you're talking about 1999, entering a graduate program and being like, wow, like this person is very different from what I had previously known in my life. But more importantly, just to add the fact that just that you could be a scholar and an activist, and that was a really an important part of our ethical way of being in the academy. I mean, it's in, and not thinking that there was any way else. And I always say I'm glad that that's how I was introduced, because to this day, I don't know if there's any other way to be. So at that time, I also was introduced to Anthropology for Liberation, the anthology by Faye Harrison, and he was one that introduced me to that. For me, I said, if it's, and he always repeated, if it wasn't Anthropology for Liberation, then what else would it be for? And I think for me, even as a teacher, if I'm not teaching students to be change makers in the world, then what am I teaching them to be? If I'm not doing research that would be about the transformation of the world and create better futures for Black people and et cetera, then why are we doing this work? So I think I'm always so grateful to Dr. Gordon for being and one of the key folks that introduced me to that. And I would say I'm also grateful, of course, to all the other folks he brought in to UT Asele Angela Johnny, for example, I'm indebted to tremendously. So I think just to give us a roadmap for how to be academics. And people say, well, how do you do this? Does it require a certain kind of courage? And it's like, you're doing the right thing. You cite Black people. It's the right thing to do. You cite the intellectually activists because they are our interlocutors. They are our intellectual interlocutors. So I think that's the right thing to do. And I think being introduced to that from the very beginning and having a certain kind of ethic that is liberatory, I think it was really important. So I just want to thank Dr. Gordon again for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for that. Dr. Gayles, is there anything that you did you want to respond to that at all? Or I don't think there's another question in the Q&A unless someone else would like to ask one more question. We're pretty much ready to close up. So unless someone has a last minute one, I'll let Dr. Gayles take a moment.
No, listen. I think Dr. Perry summed it up well, and I wouldn't dare attempt to close this session out. I would prefer to hear Dr. Gordon close it out. If you don't mind, I would defer to Dr. Gordon.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gayles. Dr. Gordon, did you want to just close us out?
Not really. I don't have anything more to say than has been said. I appreciate being here. Maybe Savannah, since you've done such a wonderful job, maybe you should close us out with some kind of reflection on what you've gotten from this as the person who's provoked us in these kinds of ways.
Thank you for sending it back my way. No, this has been really huge for me, especially as someone who's transitioning from my undergraduate degree and looking at graduate school. Like these things are like, I really grappled with this, trying to use this discipline the way that I want. And so it's been hugely, I feel so grateful to get to learn this and hear from all of you before I make those decisions and decide the direction, because it's built on that foundation that you guys have sort of been speaking about today. So I feel very grateful to your work and to the space that you've carved out for Black anthropologists and for our discipline. And yeah, it's very humbling to be able to speak to you all. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much to all the participants. And there's lots of great comments for Dr. Gordon, Dr. Gayles, and Dr. Perry. So thank you for engaging with us. And thank you to TA, the rest of the social media team, Tiffany, Chelsea, and Sarah especially. Thank you so much for your help. And also, I should note that we are going to be having another Honoring Our Elders event in February, late February, honoring Dr. Sheila Walker. So that's also something that you can look forward to. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and hope that you have a lovely rest of your day. Hope you feel inspired. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And thank you, Dr. Gordon.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Take care.